Let's create 3D letters for a text art installation. Food packaging like this Ritz cracker box is the best option when you're trying to make several letters that are going to be the same height, same width. Using the same boxes for all the letters helps you to do that. You're going to also want to make a letter template. So letter template is going to be customized to the size of the box that you're using. Because I'm using this Ritz cracker box, I'm going to cut the paper to be the size of the biggest piece for the box, which would be the front of the box, not the top or the bottom or the sides, but the front of the box, and you want it to be the full piece of that. That is going to give you the height and width of your letters that you're going to make. Once you have your paper trimmed to size, you're going to use that paper to make your template. So you want to use box letters or block letters. Those are going to be the best option for making a letter sculpture that will be freestanding. So for this one, I'm making the letter B. I'm going to be using straight lines instead of curved edges. Anything like the letter B that has a symmetry to it, you could even fold the paper to cut those two pieces out like I'm doing here to get the top and the bottom of the B to be symmetrical. So that's one way to do that. You can also fold your paper for any time that you need to make an opening, which is what I'm also going to do to make the opening in the middle of the letter B. Again, I don't really want to have it be a rounded edge though, so it's going to be a rectangular cut to keep with that block letter shape. Here's a little trick if you need to get that opening on the bottom of the letter. You can do a multiple folds, so that way you can also cut it out in the same place on the bottom. And then when you open it up, it's almost like making a paper snowflake. You should have a perfectly symmetrical block letter, letter B, that fits in your box, and then you are going to use it to trace and draw the letter onto the actual cardboard. So we're going to do this first on the one side, and then as we're doing that, we want to make straight lines that come out where the letter touches the top or bottom or side of where the box seam would be, because that is going to help you to get the thickness of the letter so that it will be a freestanding letter. The middle part of the box we're going to skip over because that is going to be the edge of the letter, and then flip your template to go in the mirror imaged side because you want it to go in the other way, so that way when you assemble your letter you will have the two sides lined up. So get all of those parts traced and outlined so that you know where you're going to be making some cuts. As you're cutting off the extra cardboard, you want to take advantage of where the natural folds or seams are for the box, because those are going to be the natural folds or seams that hold your block letter together, your letter sculpture. The extra pieces that you're cutting off, you don't want to throw away. You're going to end up using those to fill any gaps that you have after you've assembled the letter. So you want to just set those aside for now because you are going to need them later. Anything that is a opening, like the middle of the letter B, it might be easier to use a X-Acto blade or a craft knife to try to cut those out. You don't want to cut the whole thing out because you do also want to create a fold or seam there, so that way you can use that again to your advantage to fill in the space to make it more three-dimensional. So you only need to cut out 3 of the 4 sides of that opening, but you do want to make a little bit of a crease on the 4th side to make it easier for you to fold it over. So go ahead and cut all of those pieces out, including any openings that you have, and you can use your scissors to help you if you need to. The cardboard color is going to actually be the outside of your 3D sculpture of your letter. So you want to have all of your folds going in towards the inside, or the part that was originally the outside of the packaging. Then you're going to take advantage of the way the packaging actually folds up on its own to try to rebuild that box shape, but now box shape that's also your letter. So you're going to go ahead and put it back together, like a box, but this time you've cut out the parts so that it resembles your letter. It's going to take a lot of masking tape to get your letter to stay together. So the first thing you're going to want to do with your masking tape is to close up any of those seams where the box would have had a top or bottom of it that was attached originally with glue. You're going to want to tape those shut. So go ahead and get your masking tape. It is a good idea to tape it along the opening rather than across the opening. That will give you a more secure hold. You could also put some spacers in the box if you want it to have a little bit more of a sturdy feel. Usually with boxes like this one, you don't really need it, but let's say maybe you weren't using this type of box and you were just using loose pieces of cardboard. You might want to use a cardboard tube to create a little bit more structure on the inside of the box. And the way you would do that is you would cut the cardboard tubing to the height of the box a little bit more, and then you would add a flange on either side. So you would cut into it to make little tabs and then tape those tabs down inside the box. So I'm showing you how to do that, but really, if you're using a box like a cereal box or a cracker box, you probably wouldn't need this at all. It does give it a little bit more durability, but it is not 100% necessary if you're using the technique of a food packaging box. If you are using the cardboard tube bracing, you would want to attach it first when the box is completely flat. So before you've put it together to reassemble it as a box, it's a little bit easier to attach it that way than it is when it's already put back together. But then it's the same thing, you're going to close it up and tape up any of the top or bottom parts and edges with the masking tape. Again, you don't need to do this. Most likely if you're using food packaging, it holds up pretty well. It doesn't collapse on itself. So this would only be if you're using loose cardboard that maybe doesn't have those folded edges like food packaging does. This is just an extra step to make it a little bit more sturdy. Now that you've used masking tape to tape up any of the pre-existing edges that you were able to save from the packaging that you didn't cut off, now is where you need to get a little bit creative, to think outside the box a bit and use those scraps to fill in any of the gaps. So this is where you have to really try to visually see like what's going to fit in that space, and then you might have to trim some of the pieces so that they're not hanging over, and then attach with masking tape on all of the loose edges. So this is going to fill in all of those gaps. You don't want to have any gaps at all. They all need to be filled in, including any of the openings for like middle parts of the letters, like the letter B having those two openings at the top and the bottom. So go ahead and use your scraps to fill it all in. If you run out of scraps from the box that you had, it's a good idea to have some extra boxes on hand just to use for extra parts. You could also use really thick, heavy paper like cardstock or poster board to fill some of those gaps. Even if it's a little less durable than the cardboard, it should be okay because most of your letter is going to be made with the more durable cardboard. As you're working your way around your letter, filling in any of those gaps with scrap pieces of cardboard or poster board, you would also want to take advantage of this time to use any extra masking tape to really securely seal any seams or any open areas, because when you get to the next step where you're using wet plaster strips, you don't want to have any of those areas of weakness in your sculpture, any areas where moisture can get into the inside of the box. You want to make sure that you have sealed all of those seams completely with masking tape. Sometimes that means even doubly securing the tape by then taping across the ends that have wrapped around to the other side. So you want to make sure all of your tape is being held down really securely before you move on to the next step, which involves the plaster strips. When you're using plaster gauze, plaster infused gauze strips, it is very important to keep your gauze supply dry and away from the water. So you'll notice I have that on one side and I have my water source on the other side. So this is so that way I am less likely to accidentally drip water onto my supply of gauze strips. So you're going to take one piece at a time, put it into the water, sort of massage that plaster into it, and then flatten it and smooth it onto your sculpture. As you're placing more pieces, you want them to overlap a little. This helps them to stick better, and you're going to continue to do this to the entire surface area. Front, back, sides, inner areas between the openings, all of those things need to be coated with gauze that has been very carefully smoothed out. The smoothing motion is what's going to fill in the rough texture of the gauze fiber, so that way your surface is going to be smoother instead of having that rough bumpy texture. If you don't take the time to smooth your plaster gauze on, your surface isn't going to look as nice, and you could actually have some of the pieces potentially flake off. So you want to take your time and really do this carefully to make sure that everything is secured in place the way that you want it to be. This is going to take a little bit of time. You might do one side on one day, let that harden, and then do the other side on another day, because you don't really want to have the wet plaster flipped over onto your work area if you can help it. So it's going to get a little tricky as you start covering your letter, because there's going to be less space for it to be resting on your table. You might have to hold it up with one hand while you're applying plaster gauze with the other. If you need to cut the piece of plaster infused gauze smaller to have it fit into a smaller area, or to cover a small space that is just a gap on your sculpture, you can go ahead and do that. It is a really good idea to keep those scissors only for use with your plaster gauze though, because it does kind of mess up your scissors a bit. So I wouldn't use those scissors later to cut fabric or paper. Keep that with your plaster supplies so you have plaster scissors. And you want to just go ahead and finish doing that. Now, one layer of plaster gauze should be enough to make a pretty sturdy sculpture. If you have enough supply to add a second layer and you want to make sure that it is really, really solid, you could go ahead and do that, but really one layer should be plenty to make a sculpture that is durable enough to withstand being hung on a wall or stood up for display. When you are done applying the plaster infused gauze to your sculpture, you're going to need to let that completely harden. So plaster can take a little bit of time to fully cure. It might feel like it's dry to the touch, but really you want to let it sit for a while before you go to apply paint. If you apply paint and the plaster hasn't fully dried, your paint is very likely to flake off, and that is not something that you would want. The best type of paint to paint over any kind of plaster or plaster gauze is a acrylic paint. Tempera paint or other paints are very likely to flake off or not stick to the surface the way acrylic paint would. But you have to be aware that as you're applying your acrylic paint, you do have a bit of a textured surface. So you may need to scumble the brush a little to get into those textures so that you don't have little white spots left over where the plaster shows through. You're going to want to paint your entire letter, front and back, and all of the surface area, just so that way you don't see any exposed white plaster. If you know that you're planning to hang your letter on a wall and you want to save some time or save some paint, you could choose to not paint the very back of the letter. But if you are planning to display your letter freestanding so that somebody could walk around and see all of the sides, then you would want to make sure to paint everything. When you're choosing how you're going to finish the surface of your letter, the color of paint you're going to use, if you're going to use any patterns or textures, think about what your message is going to be. So if you are making a single message, you might want to have all of your letters painted the exact same way so that you have uniformity to your design.